Dakota Territory, 1883. While every settler raced to dig the cheapest dugout before winter, one Norwegian immigrant was still building in late September. His neighbors called it wasteful. They called him a fool. Lars Haugen built walls with a 6-inch cavity between them, double-layered and filled with prairie moss. He spent $45 on materials when others spent $18. He took 12 days when others finished in 4. Standard dugouts worked fine, local experts insisted. Then January 9th, 1884 arrived. The blizzard hit without warning. Temperatures plummeted to 47 below zero for 18 straight days. Standard dugouts failed completely. Interior temperatures dropped to 15 degrees despite constant fires. Families froze. 2 died. But that fool's double-wall dugout? It maintained 60 degrees inside while burning half the firewood. What did this Norwegian immigrant understand about heat, insulation, and thermal dynamics that 4-year Dakota survivors completely missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. The prairie wind cut across Cass County with the promise of another brutal Dakota winter as Lars Haugen stepped down from the immigrant wagon in late April 1883, his weathered hands already assessing the treeless landscape that would either shelter his family or kill them. At 34, the Norwegian carried knowledge earned through childhood winters on the Lofoten Islands, where temperatures dropped to 40 below, and building techniques had evolved over centuries to combat cold that could freeze a man solid in his own home. His wife Astrid clutched their 3 children closer as they surveyed the endless grassland, but Lars was already calculating soil depth, wind patterns, the critical details that separated survival from death in a territory where winter meant war. William Crawford, the unofficial township leader who had survived 4 Dakota winters, approached the new arrivals with the confident stride of a man who knew what worked. At 42, Crawford commanded respect among the scattered homesteaders, his practical knowledge of dugout construction having kept dozens of families alive through previous harsh seasons. He gestured toward the rolling hills dotted with grass-covered mounds marking existing dugouts, each one a testament to American frontier efficiency. Simple earth shelter, 12 by 16 feet lined with prairie sod, Crawford explained to Lars, outlining the proven method. Dig it in 4 days, costs $18 in materials, keeps you alive just fine. That's how we do things here. Lars nodded politely, but said nothing about the ice that had formed 3 feet thick on his family's cabin walls during Lofoten winters, or the neighbors who had died when direct earth contact stole heat faster than their fires could. Replace it. He had learned that Americans preferred their own methods, and immigrants who questioned local wisdom were quickly labeled troublemakers. Instead, he purchased his homestead claim and began studying the soil composition, the drainage patterns, the subtle signs that would determine whether his family lived or died when the killing cold arrived. By late summer, word spread through the community that the Norwegian was planning something different. Bill Morrison, who had built his own dugout in 1881 using Crawford's proven method, rode over to investigate. He found Lars sketching plans that showed 2 complete walls with a 6-inch cavity between them, filled with dried prairie grass and buffalo moss. Morrison studied the drawings with growing disbelief. "That's building 2 dugouts instead of 1, he said. "Why waste the extra lumber and time when the standard method works fine?" Lars tried to explain about thermal bridging, how frozen earth-touching interior walls would conduct heat away continuously, but Morrison was already shaking his head. The Norwegian's plan would require 240 board feet of lumber instead of the standard 140, cost $45 instead of $18, and take 12 days instead of 4. In a territory where early winter arrival meant death, such extravagance seemed not just wasteful, but dangerous. Sam Peterson, a fellow Norwegian who had arrived 3 years earlier and successfully adapted to American methods, was even more critical. At 45, Peterson had earned respect by embracing local customs rather than clinging to old country traditions. He visited Lars in early September as construction began, watching with disapproval as the immigrant dug his dugout room to 14 by 16 feet instead of the standard 12 by 16. "You're making it harder than it needs to be." Peterson said in Norwegian, then switched to English for emphasis. American methods work here. Don't embarrass us by being stubborn. But Lars continued with methodical precision, first excavating the larger room, then building a complete timber wall using mortise and tenon joints learned from his father. Each oak plank measured exactly 1 inch thick, creating an airtight barrier 6 inches inside the earth wall. The cavity would hold 48 cubic feet of dried prairie moss, cattail down, and buffalo grass, materials neighbors considered worthless, but which provided insulation value equivalent to 15 inches of modern fiberglass. Crawford organized an informal community gathering in late September to demonstrate the folly of excessive preparation. Standing beside Lars's half-completed dugout, he calculated the extra costs allowed for the assembled settlers. $27 additional materials, 8 extra days of labor, all for what? A few degrees of warmth that nobody needs. He gestured toward Morrison's and Peterson's completed dugouts, standard earth, shelters that had kept their families comfortable through previous winters. Sensible preparation is all that's required. This is showing off, pure and simple. The criticism intensified when Lars installed his double-door entry system, creating what he called a thermal airlock to prevent cold air from rushing in when the main door opened. Neighbors laughed at the complexity, joking about the Norwegian who needed 2 doors to enter his own home. Even Astrid began questioning whether her husband's methods were worth the community ridicule, especially when their children came home reporting that other families called their father wasteful and foolish. By October, as first frost approached, the construction differences were starkly visible. Standard dugouts showed simple grass-covered mounds with single doors and central chimneys, built for $18 to $20 using time-tested methods. Lars's dugout looked nearly identical from outside, but had consumed $45 in materials and featured the double-entry system that neighbors found absurd. During the mild November weather, temperature comparisons seemed to vindicate the critics. Crawford's dugout maintained 45 degrees inside when outside temperatures hit 32, while Lars's managed only 48 degrees despite all the extra expense and effort. What the community couldn't see was the fundamental difference in thermal physics at work. During moderate cold, when outside air stayed near freezing, earth temperature 3 feet down remained around 40 degrees, making thermal bridging a minor factor. But Lars knew from Lofoten experience that when outside air dropped to 40 below for days at a time, earth temperature would plummet to 15 degrees, turning direct earth contact into a deadly heat sink that no amount of firewood could overcome. His cavity wall design would prove its worth when that test arrived. But for now, in the mild autumn of 1883, it looked like the expensive mistake of a stubborn immigrant who refused to trust American frontier wisdom. Through October's crisp mornings, Lars worked alone inside his excavated room, methodically fitting oak planks into the mortise and tenon framework that would form his inner wall. Each piece required precise cutting with hand tools, the joints carved to create an airtight seal that would prevent warm interior air from reaching the cold earth beyond. His neighbors had finished their dugouts weeks earlier using rough-sawn lumber simply nailed to support posts, but Lars shaped each of his 184 planks individually, ensuring gaps measured less than 1/16 of an inch throughout the entire structure. The physics driving his design remained invisible to observers who saw only excessive craftsmanship. Standard dugouts relied on earth mass for insulation, but earth contact created thermal bridging, direct conduction paths that carried heat away from interior surfaces at the same rate cold transferred inward. When outside temperatures dropped severely, frozen soil would steal warmth faster than any fire could replace it, turning the earth shelter into a tomb. Lars's 6-inch air gap would break that conductive pathway completely, while the organic insulation would trap dead air and prevent convective heat loss. Bill Morrison stopped by during the second week of November, finding Lars carefully layering dried prairie moss into the cavity between walls. The Norwegian had spent late summer and early fall collecting specific materials, buffalo grass with its hollow stems for maximum air trapping, cattail down for fine insulation, and prairie moss that would compress slightly but maintain loft even when damp. Morrison watched the methodical process with growing impatience. "You could have built 3 standard dugouts in the time you're spending on this one," he said. "All that fuss for something nobody will even see." Lars pressed another layer of moss into place, ensuring even distribution throughout the 48 cubic feet of cavity space. He had calculated the insulation density precisely, loose enough to trap maximum air, dense enough to prevent settling that would create cold spots. The organic materials would provide thermal resistance equivalent to 15 inches of modern fiberglass, achieving an R value of 15 compared to the R3 rating of standard SOD walls. But explaining thermal coefficients to neighbors who measured success by survival rates seemed pointless. Sam Peterson arrived the following morning with William Crawford, both men carrying measuring tools to document the differences between construction methods. Peterson's standard dugout had required 140 board feet of lumber arranged in simple wall framing, while Lars had used 240 board feet for his double wall system. Crawford tallied the costs carefully. Peterson's materials cost $20, Morrison's had run $18, while Lars's $45 investment looked increasingly foolish as winter approached with no dramatic performance advantages visible. The 3 men tested interior temperatures on a calm November afternoon when outside air measured 32 degrees. Crawford's dugout showed 44 degrees, Peterson's read 45 degrees, Morrison's hit 46 degrees near his fireplace. Lars's carefully crafted thermal fortress managed only 48 degrees despite consuming twice the construction materials and 3 times the labor hours. The minimal difference seemed to vindicate every criticism leveled against the Norwegians' methods. What the temperature readings couldn't reveal was the fundamental difference in heat dynamics between moderate and extreme cold conditions. At 32 degrees outside, soil temperature 3 feet below ground remained steady around 40 degrees, creating relatively small thermal gradients that made thermal bridging manageable. Standard dugouts could maintain livable conditions because the temperature differential between interior and exterior stayed within reasonable ranges that conventional heating could overcome. Lars understood from Lofoten experience that Dakota's real test would come when outside temperatures dropped to 40 below zero and stayed there for weeks. Under those conditions, frozen Earth would reach 15 degrees or lower, creating thermal gradients of 50 degrees or more between interior and exterior surfaces. Thermal bridging would then become deadly, conducting heat away from living spaces faster than any fire could replace it. His cavity wall design would prove essential when that crisis arrived, but in November's mild weather, it looked like expensive over-engineering. Crawford organized another community gathering in early December to further demonstrate the wastefulness of excessive preparation. Standing in Lars's completed dugout, he pointed out features that seemed unnecessary: the double-door entry system that complicated simple movement, the thick moss floor layer that had required additional excavation, the central fireplace positioning that differed from standard wall-mounted designs. $27 extra and 8 additional days of work for 5 degrees of warmth, Crawford announced to the assembled families. That's paying luxury prices for survival necessities. The technical superiority of Lars's construction remained hidden beneath surface similarities. Both standard and cavity wall dugouts appeared identical from outside, grass-covered earth mounds with doors and chimneys, indistinguishable to casual observation. The critical differences lay invisible within the walls: thermal breaks versus thermal bridges, trapped air versus direct earth contact, R15 insulation versus R3 thermal resistance. These distinctions would determine survival outcomes when sustained extreme cold tested every structure to its breaking point. By mid-December, as prairie winds grew sharper and ground frost penetrated deeper, community consensus had solidified around Crawford's judgment. Lars had wasted time and money achieving negligible improvements over proven methods that had kept families alive through multiple Dakota winters. The Norwegians' elaborate construction looked like immigrant stubbornness, refusing to adapt to American frontier efficiency. Even Astrid began questioning whether her husband's perfectionism had diverted resources that could have been used more practically for food storage or additional firewood supplies. But Lars continued his methodical winter preparations, splitting 6 cords of firewood into precise sizes for maximum burning efficiency, while neighbors stockpiled standard amounts. He knew that thermal efficiency meant survival when fuel became scarce during extended cold periods, and his cavity wall design would soon face the ultimate test that would either vindicate his methods or expose them as the expensive folly his neighbors believed them to be. While neighbors completed their winter preparations by stockpiling 2 to 3 cords of firewood, Lars spent late November and early December cutting 6 cords, double the amount anyone considered necessary for a single-family shelter. Morrison watched the Norwegians' relentless wood gathering with growing bewilderment, finally confronting him at the communal woodlot where settlers took turns using the shared crosscut saw. "That Norwegian's planning to burn through wood like he's heating a mansion," Morrison told Crawford later that evening. "Either he doesn't understand Dakota fuel economy or he's showing off again." But Lars approached firewood preparation with the same methodical precision he had applied to construction. While others cut standard lengths and split pieces randomly, he sized each chunk specifically for optimal burning characteristics. Hardwood pieces measured exactly 18 inches long and split to 4-inch thickness for sustained heat output. Softwood kindling cut to 12 inches for quick ignition, and medium-density wood split to 6-inch thickness for maintaining steady temperatures overnight. He stacked the wood in precise patterns that maximized air circulation for faster drying, covering it with a lean-to shelter attached to his dugout's entrance system. The science behind his heating approach remained as invisible to neighbors as his wall construction had been. Standard dugouts required continuous burning to combat heat loss through thermal bridging, forcing families to feed fires constantly throughout cold nights and consuming fuel at unsustainable rates during extended cold spells. Lars's thick oak inner walls would absorb heat during active burning periods and radiate it back slowly as thermal mass, while his moss insulation prevented that stored heat from escaping to the frozen earth beyond. The combination meant longer intervals between firings and more efficient fuel consumption overall. Crawford found these explanations tedious and impractical. When Lars attempted to discuss thermal dynamics at Peterson's barn raising in late November, the township leader cut him short with frontier pragmatism. "Fire makes heat, wood feeds fire, and you need enough of both to stay alive," Crawford said. "Everything else is just talk." The assembled settlers murmured agreement, viewing the Norwegian's technical discussions as more evidence of his tendency toward unnecessary complication. Early December brought the season's first serious test, when temperatures dropped to 10 below zero for 3 consecutive nights. Standard dugouts responded predictably, requiring steady wood burning to maintain interior temperatures around 35 to 40 degrees. Families huddled near their fireplaces, wearing heavy coats indoors and sleeping under multiple blankets. Lars's dugout maintained 45 to 50 degrees with less frequent fires, but the difference seemed minor, enough to reinforce community skepticism about his expensive methods. Peterson documented the comparative performance carefully, visiting each dugout with a thermometer borrowed from the Territorial Land Office. Crawford's shelter averaged 38 degrees during the cold snap, while burning 1 1/10 cords of wood. Morrison's maintained 36 degrees using similar fuel consumption. Peterson's own dugout held 37 degrees. Lars's reached 48 degrees while consuming only 0.8 of a cord, 23% less fuel for 18% higher temperature. Yet the performance advantage looked incremental rather than revolutionary. At the December township meeting held in the schoolhouse, Crawford used these numbers to demonstrate what he called greenhorn excess economics. Standing before 23 families gathered for the monthly community session, he calculated Lars's construction costs against measurable benefits. This Norwegian spent $27 extra on materials and 8 additional days on labor to achieve 5 to 10 degrees of additional warmth, Crawford announced. "That's paying premium prices for marginal improvement. Dakota winters are harsh, but they're manageable with sensible preparation." The assembled families nodded approval, viewing Crawford's analysis as vindication of their collective wisdom. Sarah Morrison spoke for many when she observed that no amount of extra warmth justified such excessive preparation costs. "We're all surviving just fine with proven methods," she said. "Fancy construction won't change the fact that winter requires endurance, not comfort." Even the few families who had initially shown interest in Lars's cavity wall design now seemed convinced that standard construction remained the practical choice for frontier conditions. Lars sat quietly through the criticism, saying nothing about the ice formations he had seen on Lofoten cabin walls, or the neighbors who had frozen to death when their heating systems failed during sustained extreme cold. He understood that Americans measured success differently than Norwegians, focusing on immediate survival rather than preparation for worst-case scenarios. But he also recognized warning signs in the December weather patterns that his neighbors either missed or dismissed. Old-timers among the German families noted atmospheric phenomena that suggested unusual weather ahead. Mare's tails clouds streaming from the northwest, earlier than normal ground freeze penetrating to depths that typically occurred in January, and livestock behavior indicating severe cold approaching. The community's cattle gathered in sheltered areas, despite adequate pasture remaining available, while wild animals showed migration patterns associated with major weather system development. Hans Müller, who had survived 6 Dakota winters, observed that the signs resembled those preceding the harsh winter of 1879. But the Yazan community had successfully weathered multiple difficult seasons using standard methods, creating confidence that conventional preparation would prove adequate regardless of weather severity. Crawford dismissed talk of unusual conditions as the typical anxiety that preceded every winter season. "Every year brings predictions of record-breaking cold," he said at the meeting's conclusion. "Every year, sensible families with adequate preparation survive just fine. Panic serves no purpose when experience proves what works." By late December, weather systems moving south from Canada carried Arctic air masses that would soon test every structure in Cass County to its absolute limits. But the community faced the approaching crisis with confidence born of previous survival, trusting in methods that had kept them alive through harsh conditions before. Only Lars prepared for cold that would exceed anything his neighbors had previously experienced. His 6 cords of precisely cut firewood and cavity wall construction representing knowledge earned through survival in conditions where standard preparation meant death. The Arctic front struck Cass County without warning on January 9, 1884, driving temperatures from a manageable 15 below to a killing 35 below within 6 hours, as winds howled across the prairie at 40 miles per hour. By evening, the thermometer outside Crawford's dugout read 41 below zero, and the blizzard showed no signs of weakening. 4 feet of snow buried the scattered homesteads, turning familiar landmarks into an alien white wasteland where venturing outside meant death within minutes. Standard dugouts began failing on the second day as interior temperatures plummeted despite continuous burning. Crawford's family huddled around their fireplace, feeding it constantly with furniture, fence posts, and precious firewood reserves, yet the interior temperature dropped to 22 degrees. Frost formed on the inner walls where warm breath met surfaces chilled by direct earth contact, creating ice buildup that spread across ceiling and walls like crystalline death. The thermal bridging effect that Lars had warned about became brutally apparent. Frozen earth 3 feet below ground now measured 8 degrees, conducting heat away from interior surfaces faster than any fire could replace it. Morrison's dugout descended into crisis by day 3. Despite burning through a month's worth of firewood in 72 hours, his shelter could not maintain temperatures above 18 degrees. His youngest daughter developed hypothermia symptoms, blue lips, uncontrollable shivering, confusion, forcing the family to huddle together under every blanket they owned, while burning clothing and wooden tools to feed their failing fire. The single-wall construction that had seemed adequate during previous winters proved deadly when sustained extreme cold created thermal gradients. No conventional heating system could overcome. Peterson's family abandoned their dugout on day 6, taking refuge with the Andersons, whose larger shelter seemed marginally more survivable. By then, interior temperatures in standard dugouts averaged between 15 and 20 degrees, despite families burning everything combustible they could find. Children cried constantly from the cold until even tears froze. Adults developed frostbite on fingers and toes while sitting within 3 feet of their fires. The direct earth contact that formed the basis of frontier dugout design became a heat sink that no amount of fuel could overcome. Meanwhile, Lars's cavity wall dugout maintained steady interior temperatures between 55 and 62 degrees throughout the crisis. His family continued normal daily routines, cooking meals, reading by lamplight, sleeping comfortably without heavy coats. The 6-inch thermal break between inner oak wall and frozen earth prevented conductive heat loss completely, while the moss insulation trapped warm air that would otherwise escape through convection. His inner wooden walls absorbed heat during active burning periods and radiated it back steadily, creating thermal mass effects that maintained livable conditions with minimal fuel consumption. The physics Lars had tried to explain became starkly visible through measurable survival outcomes. While neighbors burned 4 to 5 cords of wood in desperate attempts to maintain barely survivable temperatures, Lars consumed only 2 1/10 cords throughout the 18-day crisis, while achieving interior conditions warm enough for his family to work without gloves. His thermal efficiency advantage, 50% less fuel consumption for temperatures 36 degrees warmer than standard dugouts, represented the difference between comfortable survival and frozen death. By day 10, 3 dugouts stood completely abandoned as families crowded together in whatever shelters seemed least deadly. Crawford burned through his entire winter wood supply trying to maintain 25 degrees in his dugout, then began dismantling interior furniture and wallboards to feed his fire. The community's confidence in proven methods collapsed as parents watched their children develop cold stress symptoms that presaged death. 2 elderly residents, Johann Kellner and his wife Maria, died from cold-related complications in the Anderson dugout, where 7 families had crowded together for survival. Desperate neighbors began approaching Lars for help on day 14. Pride dissolved in the face of survival necessity, as families who had mocked his excessive preparation now begged for assistance. Lars responded without condescension or lectures, sharing his firewood reserves and allowing 2 families to shelter in his unexpectedly spacious dugout. His cavity wall design had created sufficient interior room that 10 people could sleep comfortably in conditions warm enough for normal conversation and activity. The Xeon's temperature differential between construction methods became impossible to ignore. While standard dugouts struggled to maintain interior temperatures above 20 degrees, Lars's thermal fortress averaged 58 degrees throughout the worst cold period in Dakota Territory's recorded history. His family emerged each morning rested and warm, while neighbors suffered from exhaustion caused by sleeping in near-freezing conditions. Children in his dugout played normally, while those in standard shelters huddled motionless to conserve body heat. William Crawford, township leader who had dismissed cavity wall construction as wasteful excess, found himself burning his own floorboards to maintain survival temperatures on day 16. His authority crumbled along with his confidence in conventional methods as the crisis revealed fundamental flaws in accepted frontier wisdom. The man who had organized community criticism of Lars's expensive over-engineering now faced the reality that his family might freeze to death following proven techniques that had worked during previous, less severe winters. By day 18, when the blizzard finally began weakening, search parties would discover 2 families dead from cold exposure in standard dugouts, while 5 others required medical treatment for severe frostbite. Lars's family remained healthy and well-fed, their survival secured by construction methods that had seemed wasteful until extreme conditions revealed their life-saving necessity. The community's judgment of excessive preparation reversed completely, as neighbors witnessed measurable proof that worst-case scenario planning meant survival when those scenarios actually arrived. When rescue parties finally ventured out on January 27th after the blizzard's 18-day siege, they found a transformed community where survival had been determined not by courage or endurance, but by construction methods that few had understood until crisis made the differences brutally clear. The search teams discovered Johann Kellner and his wife Maria frozen to death in the Anderson dugout, where 7 families had crowded together for warmth, while the Peterson family suffered severe frostbite, requiring the amputation of 3 fingers and 2 toes. 5 other families showed symptoms of prolonged cold exposure that would affect their health for months. In stark contrast, Lars's family emerged from their cavity wall dugout healthy, well-fed, and showing no signs of cold stress trauma. His children had maintained their normal sleep schedules throughout the crisis, while neighboring families had endured weeks of exhausted vigilance, trying to keep fires burning through endless frigid nights. The measurable difference in survival outcomes forced even the most skeptical community members to acknowledge that construction methods they had dismissed as excessive had proved essential when extreme conditions tested every structure to its breaking point. William Crawford, who had organized the community criticism of Lars's building approach, made the first public acknowledgement of error at an emergency township meeting held in early February. Standing before the assembled survivors, Crawford read temperature logs that documented the devastating performance gap between construction methods. Standard dugouts had averaged 18 to 25 degrees during the worst cold, while consuming 4 to 5 cords of firewood per family. Lars's dugout had maintained 55 to 65 degrees while using only 2 1/10 cords. The thermal performance difference of 36 degrees warmer using 50% less fuel represented survival advantages that no one could ignore. Peterson, whose own family had nearly died following conventional methods, became Lars's most dedicated student as spring arrived and reconstruction began. The cavity wall technique required detailed instruction, proper joint cutting for airtight inner walls, insulation density calculations for maximum thermal resistance, moisture management to prevent settling that would create cold spots. Throughout March and April, Lars spent weeks teaching the Norwegians thermal engineering principles to neighbors who had previously mocked his elaborate preparation methods. Word of the cavity wall revolution spread beyond Cass County as territorial newspapers documented the construction innovation that had saved lives during the record-breaking winter. The Fargo, Dakota Republican published a detailed article in April 1884 titled, "Norwegian Thermal Innovation Proves Superior During Crisis," describing how traditional Scandinavian building knowledge had outperformed accepted American frontier methods. Agricultural extension agents from Bismarck visited to document the technique for distribution to new settlers arriving each spring across Dakota Territory. By summer 1884, 23 families were constructing new cavity wall dugouts under Lars's supervision, each one incorporating the 6-inch thermal break design that had proved essential for extreme cold survival. The construction process required precise instruction, oak planks cut to exact dimensions for airtight inner walls, mortise and tenon joints carved to prevent air infiltration, organic insulation layered at specific densities to achieve R15 thermal resistance equivalent to modern fiberglass systems. Morrison rebuilt his failed dugout using cavity wall methods, discovering that the additional $45 cost and 12-day construction time represented minimal investment for life-saving thermal performance. The adoption rate accelerated through summer as families who had witnessed the crisis results convinced relatives and new arrivals to abandon standard construction methods. Crawford, whose authority had been shattered by the winter's revelations, now actively promoted cavity wall techniques at township meetings and immigrant orientation sessions. By autumn 1884, over 60% of new dugout construction in the region incorporated Lars's thermal break principles, creating a construction revolution based on survival outcomes rather than theoretical arguments. Johan Eriksson, a master craftsman from Tromsø who arrived in spring 1884, provided expert validation that silenced remaining technical skeptics. At 67, Eriksson carried 4 decades of Arctic building experience and immediately recognized the superiority of cavity wall insulation for extreme climate conditions. His endorsement of Lars's methods provided traditional knowledge authority that convinced the last holdouts among immigrant communities who had questioned whether Norwegian techniques applied to Dakota conditions. The knowledge transfer expanded beyond immediate survival applications as settlers recognized broader principles embedded in Lars's approach. His systematic fuel preparation methods, wood cut to specific lengths for optimal burning characteristics, stacked in precise patterns for maximum drying efficiency, improved heating economy throughout the region. His moisture management techniques prevented the interior ice buildup that had plagued standard dugouts during the crisis. His thermal mass principles, using thick wooden inner walls to store and radiate heat, extended burning intervals and reduced fuel consumption by documented amounts. Martha Crawford, who had witnessed the temperature differentials and family health outcomes during the crisis, became an influential advocate for cavity wall adoption among settler women who understood the life or death importance of adequate winter shelter. Her detailed records of dugout performance during the 1884 blizzard provided objective data that convinced skeptical families throughout the territory. The documentation showed that thermal engineering could mean the difference between survival and death when worst-case scenarios actually occurred. By winter 1885, cavity wall dugouts showed 0 cold weather fatalities during subsequent severe weather events, while families using improved construction methods reported dramatically reduced heating costs and enhanced comfort levels. The technique remained standard throughout Dakota Territory until frame house construction became economically viable in the 1890s, ultimately saving an estimated 200 lives during the region's harsh winters, while proving that preparation for extreme scenarios often determined survival when those conditions inevitably arrived.